There's something special about Final Fantasy IX. Never before or since have I been struck in this way by the sheer beauty of a game. Not just the stunning visuals or the excellent music, but every part of it. It just feels like there was so much effort put into every aspect of this game. And as with most things, it's all about the details. Here's an example. Instead of having regular old boring save points, you save by talking to Moogles, and each and every one of them is a character all on its own. They have names and motivations and reasons for being where they are. There's even a whole side quest built around them. That sort of effort and attention to detail is what makes this game so great. This is a work of passion, and that has to do with what it is in the context of the series. If we move back to the first games, we had very traditional fantasy settings, knights and castles and villages, that kind of thing. As we moved into the 90s though, suddenly we got these gritty dystopian sci-fi worlds. Producer Hironobu Sakaguchi, who's responsible for the very first Final Fantasy game, had over the years become less and less involved with the creative side. With 9 he took a greater creative role again. His vision was for this game to be a reflection of the older games in the series. A look back, in other words, at simpler stories and a more innocent atmosphere. Here's Sakaguchi himself talking about how this approach even influenced things like the logo.
9の場合はファンタジーワールドに行こうって言った時に、全てやっぱり、1作目あたりの原点回帰みたいな。だからロゴも天野さんにお願いしたのまずクリスタルを。
This shift in tone is apparent in many choices that were made during development, like the art style. It's so colorful and imaginative. There is so much raw creativity here. There is a clear European influence in the art design, but instead of going for realism, it all feels like a fairy tale. The designers had so much fun with shapes and sizes, not just in designing the environment, but even more so when it comes to the characters. They are so weird and at the same time really distinct. You can easily recognize each and every one of them from their silhouettes alone. In addition to changing the art style and moving the setting back to a fantasy world, the story was also taken back to the more innocent and simple origins of the first games. If I had to describe this game in one word, it would be adventure. The story just moves so effortlessly from one exciting set piece to the next. The first act is just perfect. From the airship arriving in Alexandria to the crash in the evil forest, there really isn't a dull moment. The ensemble cast really helps in keeping the story moving. Every time things are about to get a bit stale or slow down, we switch characters and look at the whole picture from a different perspective. And that's just like the first hour of the game. The whole first disc is like that, especially after they introduce active time events, optional mini-stories to the mix. All this comes together to create a world that we want to explore and a world that we would like to spend time in. Even without the plot and the overarching narrative, it's fun to explore every corner of these different areas to find little moments and stories and interactions. And that's where this world really shines. Almost every character that you meet has something interesting to say. And there are all these little stories going on that you can pick up if you're paying attention. Now, a well-crafted world is important, and Final Fantasy IX certainly has one. But all the world building in the world doesn't really matter without the thing that makes us care about it the most, the characters. And as much as I've already heaped praise on this game, I have to do it again, because I love these characters. I love how they have very distinct personalities and hopes and dreams. I love how they interact with one another, how they butt heads all the time. I'm not just talking about our main party members. all over this world, we meet distinct characters. Like the whole Tantalus troupe, who could make for a pretty fun spin-off game all by themselves. Or Beatrix, who has a pretty cool redemption arc. Or my favorite, Black Mage number 288, who ponders his own existence in a way that is at once very earnest and very childlike. And 100 other characters who are all interesting and compelling in their own way. Now, I mentioned the art and the story, but I have to talk about one of the most important parts of any Final Fantasy game, the music. It's so popular that in addition to the soundtrack albums, there are piano collections, books of sheet music, and even live concerts. This soundtrack, like all of them up to this point, was composed by Nobuo Uematsu. On the surface, it's not that different from the rest of them, but he called it his favorite. Why is that? Well, to me it feels more like a singular vision than a collection of individual tracks. Not to say that the other soundtracks didn't have their own voice and identity, but this one seems to really put the emphasis on having one consistent style. It's very warm and much more fun than some of the previous entries, and this is no accident. Uematsu did aim for an atmosphere like that. He also wanted to take a step back and make it simpler and more accessible. In essence, he went for the same simplicity and innocence that was already present in the art style and the setting. Creating a soundtrack of this scale is a massive undertaking. All of the Final Fantasy scores have an enormous amount of tracks, and as far as I know, this one is the biggest of them all. There are 110 different pieces on the original album, and there is also something called the Original Soundtrack Plus, which contains all the additional music featured in the game, including the scores specifically written for the cutscenes. These tracks were actually performed by a real orchestra, which is a great choice that makes these sequences feel even more cinematic. Alright, it's time to talk about the gameplay, and here too we see a return to the roots. For the first time on the PlayStation, we got a class-based system again, and while I like the versatility and inventiveness of the materia system from 7 and the junction system from 8, I think having a predetermined set of skills and abilities for each character is still my favorite way to go. Not only does it make our party members more unique, both in and out of battle, it also makes combat more interesting and strategic. Instead of having a team made up of jacks of all trades, the characters are specialized so that when you can't beat a boss, for instance, you might switch your composition and experiment with different combinations. In fact, the game forces us to do this at several points. When there's suddenly no healer on the team, we need to adapt our playstyle by relying more on items or learning new skills or going for a more offensive playstyle, for instance. The game is creative in so many small ways. This even extends to travel. Of course, we have all the usual stuff, like ships and airships and chocobos, which I'll get to in a moment. But in addition to that, there are so many quirky and inventive ways to get around, like the air cabs, the cable car, or the wonderful Gargan Roo, all of which are not only useful, but also add another layer of depth and character to this beautiful game. Speaking of traveling, in my opinion, the classic world map peaked with this game. There's just so much to discover and so much detail everywhere you look, especially on the first continent. It really is a lot of fun to just travel from place to place. I like how movement has weight. In previous games, it always felt a bit like we were floating through the environments, but now there's a bit of momentum to our movements, and the addition of sound effects while walking and running definitely helps immersion as well. I don't know the general consensus about these little speech bubbles that pop up when we find things of interest in the world, like items or signs. Some might consider that hand-holding, but I think they not only improve quality of life, they also add to the animation-like feeling of this game. Of course, most Final Fantasy games aren't just one game. As always, there's a ton of mini-games. And to be honest, the mini-games are kind of hit and miss. I try this jump rope game every time and give up after 5 attempts. I just can't do it. And the frog catching section isn't really my thing either. As for the card game, Tetra Master, let's put it this way. It's no triple triad. But Chocobo Hot and Cold is definitely my favorite Chocobo minigame in the entire series. It's a pretty huge side quest with multiple locations and an incredible amount of treasure all around the world. And I still remember how excited I got as a kid anytime I found a Chocograph. And I think it's nice too that we get the same Chocobo the entire game. Finally, I mentioned the active time events before, and I think adding this system to the game was a stroke of genius. Here's how it works. At certain points during the game, we get the option to choose between different events happening at the same time elsewhere to see what other characters are up to. Sometimes these are plot events, but more often than not, they're just little stories that make these characters feel more fleshed out. Just knowing that while we explore a town or a dungeon, our party members are off somewhere else, thinking their own thoughts, following their own goals, and having their own interactions makes this world feel so much more real and alive. For the most part though, the gameplay is not revolutionary, and it doesn't need to be. We explore the map, we get into random battles, we grind, we enter towns, we go to shops, we sleep at inns. In other words, it's classic Final Fantasy, and that's all it needs to be. The creators decided to take systems that we already knew and loved and just use them as a baseline to build on. Instead of trying to be as unique as possible with the mechanics, they went the opposite route by looking at all the games that came before and picked all the stuff that made the series what it is. In the end, Sakaguchi's vision came true, at least for him. When the game was finished, he called it his favorite in the whole series. It was, in his words, closest to the ideal view of what Final Fantasy should be. Of course, the game isn't perfect. The story loses steam around the time we get to the second continent, and it loses some of that innocent, adventurous feeling toward the end, in favor of a more conventionally existential plot. There are technical issues too, like long load times or annoyingly repetitive battle intros, a few other things too, but it's still a once-in-a-lifetime experience. One of those things that I would love to forget just to experience it again for the very first time. All this isn't to say that other games in the Final Fantasy series aren't amazing, but for 9 it just feels like they went the extra mile. There's no loose ends, no half-finished plot points, no ambiguous or impossible to figure out quest lines. The game is finished, and you can really tell how they took their time with it. The influences from previous games show, not just in references and similarities, but in the way all the elements that make up Final Fantasy IX have been honed and polished. It also, in a way, really lives up to the franchise's title. It's a game of finals. The final game on the PS1, the final game with a world map, the final game with no voice acting. It really is the end of an era, and a worthy one at that. In the end, it all comes down to very basic ideas: simplicity, innocence, adventure, and maybe just being a bit more creative with your save points.